Rolling Hills is an inspiration for all of the Christians and churches in this area, and whoever knows about the work here at Rolling Hills. I know you do a lot of good through the Bible camp. I know you've heard that before and you believe that, but I want you to hear it again. Keep on keeping on. And my dad was a preacher. He was a stateside missionary, domestic missionary in the South. He never preached for a church larger than 60 people. Frequently, when we had worship, it was Dad and me and my two brothers who were leading in worship. So, for those who are from smaller congregations than Rolling Hills, I appreciate your service and your work and your dedication. Remember, when Jesus comes again, He's not looking for numbers, He's looking for faith. We have a man from Michigan, from the Grand Rapids area, who's at the School of Preaching in Knoxville for the next 2 years, and we're going to be supporting him. He has, I think he said, 20 or 30 churches that are supporting him, which is about 19 too many. You know, there ought to be one church or two churches that put their finances behind an individual, get him through school, and then do another one. But I told Swartz Creek we need to help support him so we can bring him back to Michigan. We need all the sound preachers in the state of Michigan we can get. And I hope we can support him in Michigan somewhere, and it might be a congregation of 30 or 40 people, but that'll be 30 or 40 people in heaven that wouldn't have been there otherwise. So wherever you are and wherever you're serving, God bless you and stay faithful. Habakkuk chapter 2. We began looking at chapter 1, and I mentioned the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, Tea Parties. These and other social justice movements have in common the call for justice. They want justice. They want fairness. They want the world to be fair. And individually, you have it in your congregation. You have it here at Rolling Hills. We have it at Swartz Creek. Sometimes we wonder, where is God's fairness? Where is His justice? Why do evil people get away with doing wickedness? Why do wicked people have children when Christians cannot? My sister is one of them. She and her husband are strong, faithful, dedicated Christians, but she's never been able to get pregnant. And Christians ask, why not? Why do Christians experience divorce when they have done all they could to have a good marriage? Why do Christians have to get these horrible diseases like cancer or Alzheimer's when they're trying to do right? Where is God's justice? So when your love for Jesus and your idea of justice collide, when you question God's justice, what do you do? And that's the idea that we see playing out here in the life of Habakkuk the prophet. Again, Habakkuk lived 600 years before Christ, before the nation of Babylon will march against and destroy Jerusalem. Again, that's going to be about 15 years to the future of when Habakkuk is living. Habakkuk doesn't know that's happening until God tells him. And then he has a problem with that. What do you do when you question God's justice? We began our study last hour in chapter 1 when we looked at the chapter that I call Perverted Justice. That's Habakkuk's words in verse 4 of chapter 1. And in that lesson, we looked at chapter 1 where we saw that when you question God's justice, number one, you pray to God, verses 1 through 4. But you can't talk to God without listening to God. So that's verses 5 through 11. Listen to God when you question His justice. And then also in chapter 1, we saw that you have to meditate on God's nature. Always remind yourself of who God is, and God cannot change. He cannot choose to be different than who He is. Verses 12 through 17. But Habakkuk was not quite finished with his discussion with God about this issue. And so we take up Habakkuk chapter 2 in this hour of study, and Habakkuk waits to hear from God. That's verse 1. Do you remember Isaiah's words that somebody has turned into a song, and I'm sure you probably sing it here at Rolling Hills, chapter 40, verse 31, where Isaiah says, "Those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary." That's Habakkuk's message here in verse 1. He's waiting to see what the Lord is going to respond to him relative to the question about justice. Verse 1, I'm reading. "I will stand on my guard post and station myself on the rampart, and I will keep watch to see what He will speak to me. and how I may reply when I am reproved. The first thing we see here is that Habakkuk is determined to stand firm as he waits to hear what God says. But he uses battle imagery. Notice the imagery that Habakkuk is using here when he speaks. At my guard post. That's military imagery there. Let me stand, he says. Let me resist at the defensive tower, he calls out. Let me keep a close eye out to see what God will say to me. Now, of course, Habakkuk is speaking about God. He's not happy. He's not content with God's message that Babylon is going to destroy Israel. But now Habakkuk also braces for what he knows is coming, a reprimand from God. He says, let me keep a close eye to see what I will reply when I am, observe, reproved, when I am reprimanded. Twice in chapter 1, Habakkuk spoke to God and cried out to God how God's plan can be consistent with God's nature. Just like a child who has questioned mom or dad's wisdom and knowledge and then flinches when mom or dad turns around to give them an answer. Habakkuk here flinches, waiting to be reprimanded for his questions with God. Now the rest of chapter 2 is God's response to Habakkuk. God has told Habakkuk that he's going to raise up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, who have their own definition of justice. But God's message to Habakkuk is that Babylon will also be punished. Let's consider God's answer to Habakkuk here in chapter 2. God's response. Point number 1, verses 2 and 3. God says, I have decided what I have decided. God tells Habakkuk to write down this message, Habakkuk's prophecy, so that Israel can have a copy of it as they run from the Babylonian army. They need to know that God predicts the future, and God can control the future. The Babylonians are coming, and at this point, there is nothing that will be done to stop the punishment. When I was little, and I misbehaved in church, it was not uncommon for my mom to grab me up over her shoulder, take me out of the auditorium, and spank me. Once she says, and I don't remember this personally, but she's told the story several times, she said that as she was going out, people around her could hear me as she carried me up the aisle, me crying out, I'll be good, I'll be good. But Mom said by then it was too late. She was going to go out and finish what she had started once she had stood up. And I told her one time, I said, Mom, you know, God has grace. And Mom said, yes, son, but by that time my grace had worn out. Here, God's grace has an ending point. God's patience has an ending point. In this situation, God tells Habakkuk his patience has reached its final point. Let's read the text. Then the Lord answered me and said, record the vision and scribe it on tablets, that the one who reads it may run, for the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens toward the goal, and it will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it will certainly come, it will not delay. Record and inscribe, how the New American Standard translates verse 2. It means write clearly. Read the vision and inscribe it on tablets so that one who reads it who runs can read it. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. Notice in verse 3 how determined God's plans are. First, he says the time is appointed. God has determined what is going to happen. The punishment at the hands of the Babylonians, he also says, number 2, hastens toward the goal. God almost pictures those war horses mentioned back in chapter 1 and verse 8, running full speed across the landscape, heading right towards Jerusalem. Number 3, God says his plan will not fail. It's not happening immediately, but God says wait for it. And then number 5, he says it will come. And in fact, the Hebrew verb translated, "it will come," is very emphatic. The New American Standard says, "it will certainly come. It will not delay." Like my mom picking me up and carrying me out of worship to spank me, God has already determined that the punishment is coming from Babylon, and Israel needs to know that it is coming. And now God is also going to explain how wicked Babylon is. And so, yes, Babylon will also be punished. That's point number 2, verses 4 and 5. Babylon is guilty of arrogance. Read the text. "Behold," God says, "as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by faith. Furthermore, wine betrays the haughty man, so that he does not stay at home. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and he's like death, never satisfied. He also gathers to himself all the nations and collects to himself all peoples." So we observe here that Babylon is guilty of pride and arrogance, thinking that they can get away with whatever their heart desires. And so in the middle of this rebuke of arrogance, Habakkuk gives us a verse, a principle, and I hope you have this highlighted in your Bible in some way, chapter 2, verse 4. Because the Apostle Paul found it quite useful in his own writings. The righteous will live by his faith. Babylon was living by pride. Babylon was living by arrogance. Babylon was living by strength, by worshiping their strength and their power. But the righteous will live based on his trust in God. Wasn't that a strong, appropriate message for God to give his people at that time through Habakkuk? Isn't that the fundamental message that God gives us today? So that the Apostle Paul will quote this verse in Romans chapter 1 and verse 17, and in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 11, and in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 38. As a minister of the Word, I frequently tell people in the congregation that, especially elderly people, those in the nursing homes, the righteous live by faith. That's a fundamental message of the Christian walk. We are so ignorant about the future, and we are so powerless to do anything about what happens in this world. We have to walk by faith in Jesus Christ. That message really does not change, and it has not changed in the history of mankind. It goes back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, even till today, and Habakkuk's people needed to hear it. So verse 5. Habakkuk does not explicitly condemn wine here in verse 5, but he does suggest that it is under the influence of alcohol that Babylon's arrogance is exacerbated. The word for man here, wine betrays the haughty man. The word for man here in the Hebrew language is the word for warrior. I don't know if Habakkuk has in mind literal warriors, they're military, but I suggest that he views Babylon as a whole, that Babylon sees themselves as warriors, and they are haughty, and they are arrogant. They did not stay within the boundaries of their own kingdom. They did not stay at home. But rather, this nation had an appetite for more and more land, and they wanted to spread across the world and conquer some more, and conquer some more. Their appetite was endless, Habakkuk says, or God says, through Habakkuk, like the unseen world, like Sheol or death, and they were not satisfied. They continued gathering nations under their rule, their sovereignty, and they collected more peoples to themselves. Now, if God is going to punish pride and arrogance in the nation of Babylon, will He not also punish pride and arrogance today? Will He not punish pride and arrogance today in Christians and non-Christians alike? Isn't there a message for us today? Point number 3 in God's speech to Habakkuk, God is going to take care of Babylon. No, sin will not go unpunished. We think it does, or sometimes it appears like it does, but sin will not go unpunished. God says in Numbers chapter 32 and verse 23, be sure your sins will find you out. God was giving us a permanent spiritual principle that any sin committed by anybody at any time is going to repel them from the nature of God if it is not forgiven. There is no statute of limitations when it comes to violating God's laws. He who sows to the flesh will reap corruption, Paul says in Galatians 6 and verse 8. So here in this strophe, verses 6 through 8, God promises that Babylon will be conquered by someone at some point in time, at God's choosing. Let's read the text. Will not all of these take up a taunt song against him, Babylon, even mockery and insinuations against him, and say, woe to him who increases what is not his? For how long? And makes himself rich with loans. Will not your creditors rise up suddenly, and those who collect from you awaken? Indeed, you will become plunder for them. Because you have looted many nations, all the remainder of the peoples will loot you, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town, and all of its inhabitants. God promises Babylon will be conquered by someone. At some point, someone is going to write a taunt song, a song of mockery against Babylon. Will they conquer Jerusalem? Yes. But God is also going to conquer them. Woe to him who increases what is not his. If you take advantage of other people, at some point, God is going to take advantage of you. God will not tolerate evil. Habakkuk saw that back in chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. And so in verse 7, Babylon will become plunder for some other nation at some point in the future. Their creditors will rise up and call in Babylon's loan, and they will not have the resources to pay. To use banking terminology, that's Habakkuk does there in verse 7. Why? Because in verse 8, they have looted other people. The word you here in verse 8 is emphatic. Babylon herself has looted, and therefore she will be looted. She will be looted by many nations because she looted other nations. What goes around, comes around. The bloodshed and violence that Babylon inflicted on other peoples are now going to be inflicted on her by the God of heaven. So if God is going to punish Babylon for her sins, shouldn't Israel be concerned about her sins? Shouldn't we? And all Americans, in fact every nation in the world of our day, be concerned about their sins? Be sure your sins will find you out. And so point number 4, in verses 9 through 11, God does not tolerate inhumanity. That's what we see here in this strophe. Verse 9, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. This man that God pictures here is prospering through his evil. He's prospering through extortion. He's prospering through bribery and through theft any way he can. And with it, he puts his nest on high as if he were an eagle. That is, he thinks that he makes himself immune to judgment. Like certain of our politicians, right? They think they're untouchable by the law. That's what these people are here that God pictures. Immune to judgment. He thinks that through his wealth that he has delivered himself from the hand of calamity. Verse 10, you have devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many peoples, so you are sinning against yourself. Babylon is living a shameless life and cutting off other peoples. But in her inhumanity, she is refusing to practice the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do to you. And God says they were sinning against themselves. Who sees Babylon's sin? Babylon's evil, Babylon's wickedness. Everyone does. Everyone are witnesses to Babylon's evil. Look at verse 7. Surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework. To use Jerusalem as an example, every stone in the wall around Jerusalem is going to see and experience Babylon's evil. These stones are going to be witnesses of Babylon's evil when they invade every house in Judah, every rafter that will be torn down by the Babylonians. Their warriors is going to answer and testify to the evil that Babylon is implementing. But God does not tolerate inhumanity. Point number 5, verses 12 through 14. God will make himself known among the nations. Verse 12, woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. Habakkuk mentions Babylon's bloodshed 3 times. Now, this is the only time that Habakkuk uses this word for violence. It might be understood better as injustice. The other word for violence that he uses so frequently, for example, verse 8 and verse 17, this word for violence in the Hebrew language is Hamas. I don't know how closely the Arabic word is to the Hebrew word, but this Hebrew word for violence is Hamas. And Habakkuk uses it 6 times. Babylon was clearly a bloodthirsty, wicked, violent nation. Verse 13. Is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that peoples toil for fire and nations grow weary for nothing? What is God saying to Habakkuk in this verse? It's easy to understand the second part of the verse. Nations work, nations grow weary for nothing. If nations do not serve God, then ultimately their work is in vain. If we understand that part of the verse, then we can examine the first part and understand it in some way to be parallel. In fact, to get off on a short tangent here, that is the fundamental quality of Hebrew poetry. If you're reading the book of Psalms, the book of Proverbs, Hebrew poetry does not rhyme. It doesn't have meter. Well, Hebrew scholars debate whether or not it has meter. But the fundamental quality of Hebrew poetry, and this is poetry, is that the ideas are parallel. And so if you can understand one idea, then you may have an idea of what the other point means because the ideas are parallel. Now, sometimes they're not synonyms, they're antonyms. Sometimes the ideas are opposite. So you've got one idea and then you've got the other idea. Maybe I should have done the first one this way. Parallel ideas and then opposite ideas. And that's the fundamental nature of Hebrew poetry. So if we can understand the second part of the verse, nations grow weary for nothing, then it should help us understand what people's toil for fire means. And let me suggest to you that if we understand fire here to refer to smoke, then maybe we can understand what God is talking about here. And that is, the people toil for smoke. That is, their work ultimately will go up in smoke. God will bring Babylon to an end. Their work will go up in smoke. And all that they work for will come to nothing. So we want a strong country economically, right? A good, economically strong United States of America is good for our people and is good for the rest of the world. But we can't put spiritual values and morality on the back burner in order to reach that goal. Because spiritual values and morals are more important than economics. Israel had a hard time grasping that concept. Here in verse 14, God says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." God will make himself known. God made Pharaoh to know who he was. God wants Israel to know who he is. In fact, the next time you read about the Exodus out of Egypt, Exodus chapters 5 through 14, When you read those chapters there, circle or highlight every time you find the word know, K-N-O-W, every time you find the word know. Because one fundamental reason why God brings Israel out of Egypt through those 10 plagues is so that Egypt will know God and so that Israel will know God. Here God says Babylon is going to know who He is. Knowledge of the glory of Jehovah God is going to be spread throughout the world, just as the waters of the ocean cover the planet. Family, man must know God. You cannot respect God until you know God. You remember when the Assyrians invaded, and it was the policy of the Assyrians to take peoples that they have conquered and move them to another nation. When the Assyrians moved the northern peoples out of Israel, they moved other peoples into Israel, including some Babylonians, incidentally, 2 Kings chapter 17. And those people did not know God. They didn't know Jehovah God, and so God sent lions into the land who killed some of those people. And they cried out to the king of Assyria, and the king of Assyria says, well, let me find some priests from the Israelite people that can come and teach you the law of the Lord. You've got to know God. You can't respect God if you don't know Him. And so if God will make Himself known and respected when it comes to the Babylonian nation and relative to the Israelite nation, He will also make Himself known to the American nation. The only work that is really ultimately important is work done for the Lord Jesus Christ and spreading the knowledge of the glory of Christ around the earth as the waters cover the seas. The United States of America will one day go up in smoke and will come to nothing. And the only thing that will remain will be the church of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's what's important. Verse 6, point number 6. Verses 15 through 17, Babylon will drink of God's wrath. Verse 15, woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom even to make them drunk so as to look on their nakedness. The word venom here can be understood as anger or rage. Translators, I think, use the word venom because it is mixed in a cup, and the nations are made to drink. Babylon made other nations drink of their wrath, experiencing the destruction, so now Babylon could look on the nakedness of other nations, to look on their weaknesses, to take advantage of their weaknesses. And they experienced the destruction so that Babylon was successful. But in keeping with the justice of God, in keeping with this concept that you reap what you sow, God is going to make Babylon experience that same thing. Babylon is going to drink from the wrath of God. Verse 16. You will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. Now you yourself drink and expose your own nakedness. The cup and the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will come upon your glory. Babylon will drink the cup of disgrace, not the cup of honor. Babylon will have its own weaknesses exposed, its own inward parts revealed as God makes Babylon drink of the cup of His wrath, the cup from the Lord's right hand, the symbol of His power. And then utter disgrace will cover Babylon's glory, and that nation will be humiliated. When you read the revelation of John, John will take the imagery of Babylon and he will apply it to the Babylon of his own nation, the Roman Empire. And John will say that God will make the Babylon of his day, the Roman Empire, drink of the cup of the wrath of God unmixed. Unmixed. What will it like to be in hell? You realize man has never known a time that he has not experienced the grace and the goodness of God. The wicked, the atheists, have never known a time that they have not experienced the goodness of God. But hell will be the absence of the goodness of God. God's wrath unmixed. Verse 17 to Babylon, God says, for the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and the devastation of its beasts by which you terrified them because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town, and all of its inhabitants. Here again, God returns to one of the prime motivations for his punishment of the Babylonians: violence. Violence done to Lebanon, north of Israel, that will come back over and overwhelm Babylon. The devastation that Babylon inflicted on the animals of the land will come back over against Babylon and terrify them. It's because of the bloodshed and the violence that Babylon inflicted on others. Yes, Babylon will drink of the cup of the wrath of God. Now, we happen to have some of the historical fulfillment of this prophecy in the Bible. Most of it we have to get from secular sources. But Babylon fell to the Persians in 539 BC. And we can read about the fall of Babylon. You know about it in Daniel chapter 5. The handwriting on the wall, that's the fall of Babylon. And in connection to the prophecy of Babylon's destruction, we will see in Daniel chapter 5 the mixing of pride and intoxication and the wrath of God when God brings Babylon to an end. Point number 7. God tells Habakkuk and the faithful in Israel, keep silent before the awesome power of Jehovah God. As if to save the worst for last, God criticizes Babylon's religion. That is, they worship false gods. Verse 18. What profit is the idol when its maker has carved it, or an image, a teacher of falsehood? For its maker trusts in his own handiwork when he fashions speechless idols. If a god has to be carved, what profit is that god? You have to make it. How can that god provide for you? What profit does an image have when it is a teacher of falsehood? You can't trust a god that is not teaching the truth. Idol worshipers trust in their own handiwork, even as he is making the idol that is speechless. Isaiah the prophet mocks idolatry extensively among the Assyrians, but among the Israelites, because they're following the ways of the Assyrians. And Isaiah will say, you go out in the woods and you chop down a tree, you burn half of it in your fireplace to give you heat. You take the other half and you willow it out and you make a god, and you carry that god with you everywhere you go, and then you ask that god to predict the future? How ridiculous is that? Oh, sin is always irrational. Sin is always irrational. Idol worshipers trust in their own handiwork as he is making that idol that is speechless. God speaks. Idols can't speak. Why trust idols? Verse 19. Woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise. And that is your teacher? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there's no breath at all inside it. God continues his mockery of idolatry. The Babylonians cry out to their piece of wood, which they have carved into a god. They say, awake! Wake up, God! I need to trust you to take care of me. Idol worshipers call out to the rocks that cannot speak, and they say, arise! Get up, God! I need you to take care of me. God asked Babylon, is that your teacher? Seriously? But keep in mind, Israel is being punished by the Babylonians for the exact same reason. Israel was worshiping the same gods as the Babylonians. So even as God mocks idolatry among the Babylonians, he is sending a message to his own people Israel how ridiculous it is to worship and trust in idols. Their God might look good on the outside. They're overlaid in gold and silver, but there's still no breath on the inside. It was still an inanimate object. It's still just a piece of wood or a rock. Finally, God gives Habakkuk and other faithful Israelites a word of encouragement. He did back in verse 4 when he said, the righteous will live by his faith. He did in verse 14 when he says, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Here in verse 20 is another word of encouragement. The Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before Him. God is not an idol where He can be moved around from place to place. God is not an idol where He needs to be carved out of wood or fashioned from metal after the imaginations of man. God cannot be overlaid with gold and silver as if He needed to be made more beautiful to look at. God dwells in heaven. God does not have to be awakened. God dwells in His holy temple. He is accessible everywhere. Therefore, the whole earth needs to shut its collective mouth in the presence of God, standing in His holy presence, and be ready to respond to God's commands. Don't talk. Listen. And then obey. And that's one of the hardest things to do. But that's what it means to live by faith. Chapter 2, verse 4. Habakkuk expected to be reprimanded back in verse 1, but God reprimands Babylon. To Habakkuk, God says, Habakkuk, trust me. The whole earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. I dwell in my holy temple. Be silent. So, family, let's be reminded this morning as we wonder about how God works in this world. God does not tolerate arrogance. God will take care of the wicked. God does not tolerate inhumanity. God is going to make Himself known through His actions. The wicked one day will drink from the wrath of God. I don't want to be among that number, do you? We need to keep silent before the awesome power of God and wait for Him to work. Again, do you have any thoughts or comments or questions before we take a break? All right. We'll take 5. We'll take 15. They're here 20?